Going live. All right, we're live. Welcome to, oh, that's brighter now. TSC, the Science of Consciousness, Day 2. And we're going to just do our own little discussion here about what we've seen so far from the P.e.a.c.e Inc. studio in a secret location in Alameda. And so yesterday we had a number of themes. The main one was psychedelics, which was very interesting. It was a 3-hour psychedelic symposium. And we also saw a workshop from IONS, the Institute of Noetic Science, and they talked about the science of interconnectedness and all of that. And another theme was the machine consciousness and what it means when a machine is conscious and stuff of that sort. So let's just go through them one by one, I guess. Maybe let's start with the psychedelics, if you want.
Psychedelics was pretty cool. I think the one that's probably most applicable to us. I mean, they are both, but
yeah,
the machine learning.
That
was probably. We'll talk about them all, obviously.
Yeah.
But when I think about those three topics in particular, we're sitting behind something that is particularly or something sitting behind us. That's particularly that.
Yeah.
So, what did you pull away from either of those?
Yeah. Well, this is kind of where we have to get careful about definitions of consciousness. And when we asked a question about, or I was the one who asked this, I think, about, do you guys think it's useful? I don't remember who it was, but it was in that discussion section of like, do you think it's useful to define consciousness in a different way when we're talking about machine consciousness? And the response was kind of, oh, well, we hate talking about definitions of consciousness. Yeah, I actually hate talking about definitions of consciousness too. And usually when people do that is they're just sitting and discussing things for hours of, oh, I think consciousness is that. And I think Don Hoffman was talking about this before. Words like time, perception evokes very different neural pathways in different people.
Yeah.
So I think what we have to agree on is that we're not going to entirely agree on definitions of consciousness, but we can agree on it for the sake of a discussion, for the sake of a certain model. For a certain model.
Sure.
Right. That's operational definitions. To say, okay, we're not going to agree entirely on what consciousness means when you mean this or that, or a general definition. But for this, we can define it a certain way and say, this is what we mean when we say consciousness. So I think that discussion of definitions is worth it. And really two things come out of that. Well, there's the standard way of thinking about artificial intelligence as passing the Turing test. And, well, is it consciousness? Can we reproduce human-like consciousness in a machine? Can we take this, copy it, and make it over there?
And I would say in that is where the fork occurs.
Yeah.
For me, in the definition of consciousness specifically has to do with the living entity, a biological function.
Right. Do you want to explain that a little more, the living entity and how?
Well, how does consciousness arise? If we take this way, I think if you take the Occam's razor approach and work with just what you got, work with what you have. And so like we know that we have a body, we're conscious in the sense we understand consciousness, and we're part of a larger extended system. We have a collective consciousness. We are connected to each other, both electromagnetically, just sitting here. Our electromagnetic spheres are commingling with each other. And so by the strictest sense, I define, and this isn't really necessarily my definition. This is like, you can look through ancient manuscripts and find very similar definitions.
Leo's definition of consciousness.
Radically different than nobody's ever thought of this before. No.
Right.
It's basically the life force that lives within us all living things that have a life force. If you reproduce, and which plant is not part of a larger plant ecosystem? None. Which human is part of a non-larger human ecosystem? None. We are not individuals only, ever. We are always all connected with each other. Therefore, the machine that we have behind us, and I think the way it rolls out is that you can embody a machine with human-like qualities. But
Yes.
the connection that creates our consciousness and really some of the chaos that goes in is not us internally. It's also our connection to the external world and each other.
Mm-hmm.
That even if you could perfectly simulate the brain function and input it into a machine, they're not going to have that life force,
Right.
or that connectedness to the input from the external
Right.
environment. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, and obviously, you know, we don't know exactly. You know, like I can't say for sure that a computer is not going to have an inner experience of its own. There's no way of proving that. But we're not really talking about that. We're talking about a working model of consciousness in a machine that is an extension of ourselves. So there's the phenomenal consciousness, which is very interesting. I've published lots of stuff on that, and I think that question is entirely worth discussing. But that's a separate question from, can we make a machine that, regardless of whether or not it's phenomenally conscious in and of itself, or functions, or you can upload your consciousness into it or whatever,
right?
Whether it can act as a consciousness enhancing mechanism for the human. So these are the two different kinds of artificial consciousness that I think are important to distinguish explicitly. And so that people know what we're talking about when we say, hey, this is a form of artificial consciousness. By that, we do not mean that it is a upload
Correct.
of my mind.
But it does mean that uploads from our mind could contribute it to its function in some way.
Right,
so for example, with an EEG,
mm-hmm.
right, we can train a robot through machine learning to run around this apartment and vacuum. And we could potentially have the ability to program the computer to take over for us.
Yes.
And to simulate those actions from the outside, somebody just looking, it might actually look like the computer is alive and making its own conscious decisions, but that's the hidden mechanism on the underneath.
Right.
We would know that that's not the case.
The life force is us.
We're the life force.
It's not, and that's an extension of our life force.
Right. Right.
It doesn't necessarily have its own life force.
Correct.
Which is, and so, yeah. So I think that's really the key here. And so, what would you say? This was a question that got asked yesterday, but I'm curious what you think. What would you say would be like an equivalent Turing-like test for us? Something, how would you, so talking strictly about our definition of consciousness, how could we test that the computer is an extension of our consciousness in that way? Like an equivalent Turing test for this kind of machine.
Well, I don't think it would necessarily. Oh, it's a car alarm. Let's just say if Halo is the computer behind us. Halo stands for Hypercube Algorithmic Language Oracle. And we currently have a structure for a language database that's being wired up right now with the roughly 8,000 word capacity, right? So that could have we could brainwave and train it to respond to our consciousness, and we could use our programming, what we call the sampling method that we've developed. We could do that, and it would kind of mimic it. And it could potentially even pass a test.
Yeah.
It could pass a test to where people could look at it and say, wow, it seems like it's got its own personality. But what would it be missing? It's not a biological entity.
Right.
So it's like this would be more of like having a bionic arm or leg put in just to make you stronger.
Yeah.
Right. And so when it's not in coherence, that's the coherent sampling we're discussing, it's just operating in sort of random chaos mode. But you can come in and embody it with some elements, even through phones, to where it would start responding to you and respond. And in a way, you could program it with the language. Let's say you put it in a house and there was a whole family that was giving it constant input. right? It would respond in kind and eventually get to the point where it would seem like it's alive, at least verbally.
It would function that way.
It would function that way and interface with the people that way. But when they're not home, it's kind of just in dormant mode. It's not just going out and operating in the same way. And we have the sensors back here that can prove that can show how that works. And so for me, there's different types of artificial intelligence. None of them have to do with them being conscious themselves.
Right.
You could do
phenomenally conscious.
Phenomenally conscious, and that internal quality. I think it's a wonderful thing to talk about. You have it in all kinds of movies, literature throughout time, right? Yeah. Throughout recorded time. I mean, and that idea is pervasive. I'm sure if we can go back to ancient mythology and find it as well.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, it's all over the place.
And so that's what a god is, imbued. And so we have that natural tendency to do that. But if we can come to a definition of terms with systems and models that we can test, so much of the world, 80% of science seemingly is discussing semantics and arguing about stuff that can't even be tested in any sense of the word. And so I would like to enter into the logic and reason zone. Right, where you just had like some ground rules where you could only use real world examples. So like if you want to discuss relativity, no spaceships, no twins growing older than their parents, stuff like that.
Yeah, that'd be very hard for some people.
It would be impossible for most people.
Yeah,
I think.
Right.
Because that's most of what they're doing, and not that that's not valuable, but think about this: Einstein, one of the greatest revelations in all of science, was special and general relativity, right?
Yes.
How many multi-million-dollar experiments did Einstein conduct before coming up with the idea? The answer is 0.
None.
Right? He was kind of an outcast within the academic community. He didn't go right on to teaching. He went out and had to get a job. And he worked in the patent office doing what? Figuring out how shit actually works, not stuck in an academic setting discussing gobbledygook hour after hour after hour, coming to no conclusions other than who's going to get the next award, who's going to get credit for this, he was completely outside that world, and he was just looking at stuff that other inventors that were creating works of art that actually worked and wanted to protect them and patent them. So he's reviewing all this stuff, and then one day he's like, oh, what if I was a beam of light? And came up with this wonderful, I think one of the people here, I don't remember who it was, made a really good analogy when he told the story. And that was that Einstein, he didn't just come up with this and then let it go.
Yeah.
He came up with it and had to teach himself the mathematics to make this happen, because the mathematics did not exist.
Right.
Just like the mathematics don't pre-exist for this or any other invention that doesn't exist. Right? That's just the process. So he really struggled for that. Now, how many multi-millions of dollars of experimentation did it really take to prove it? Not very much. A telescope. I mean, it was a big telescope, and they had some, but just like
relativity and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the first big test was the telescope during an eclipse.
Yeah, it's still, I mean, there's still ongoing stuff that validates it, tests various parts. But yeah, that obviously takes. But yes, to come up with an idea or I shouldn't just say an idea, but like some kind of insight about the nature of reality does not really come from reading hundreds of papers over and over. At least it doesn't for me. And, I think this kind of segues nicely into our next, we were going to talk about the science of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And how.
And the lack of interconnectedness that was there. Let's just call it that.
Yeah.
So how would you summarize the purpose of that, even using the word interconnectedness?
Well, interconnectedness is about, it's kind of self-explanatory, that word. But yeah, I mean, it's the idea
No,
that
I don't
one
think it
thing,
is, because what I saw was not interconnected.
right. Right. But well, there's what we saw, and then there's what it's supposed to be.
So what I'm asking,
is,
in your opinion, what was it supposed to be? What is that interconnectedness? Because when I hear that, I hear we are all one. We're in this together.
Yes.
Not what we heard. So, but continue.
Correct.
What, in your opinion, is that interconnectedness, or what do you think it should be for our readers? Like, if when you use the word interconnectedness in an appropriate manner,
it means everything is dependent on everything else. You can't isolate one part of the system and then have it function the same way. You can't get rid of one individual piece and then have the whole not be affected.
Or one individual,
right. And if we're talking about the nature of science and progress, eliminating one individual from the discussion is anti-progress and counter to the nature of interconnectedness. And yeah, so I mean, it's you know, reading, like we were saying, reading lots and lots of papers is nice, but not all the best ideas are necessarily going to come from people who have millions of dollars,
right?
And you know, and have been through the peer review process. Peer review is still, don't get me wrong, peer review is a very necessary part of science for it to progress. We have to go through peer review. We're in the works of pushing several peer-reviewed publications right now. But that being said, insights into the nature of reality cannot only come from reading literature. There has to also be a source of creativity, and that's what I go back to all the time. Creativity and practice, right? That is the integration of art and science that I'm always, I'll never not stop making that point, because that's just so easily missed and overlooked.
Yeah, and actually in this book here, just happen to have it, Art and Physics by Leonard Shlain. I think a person's understanding of either topics is incomplete without that book. Because it does show the interconnectedness, and particularly the creative process. And if you look at the state of, let's just say particle physics. Particle physics hasn't made really any, the predictions of the Higgs boson is 50 years old. So it took 50 years to solve one thing, right? And Tesla said it best 100 years ago around that, we even put this in our press release, you know, scientists wander from math equation to math equation and come up with a version of the world that doesn't even resemble our experience.
Right.
And what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Now the bad thing is that now I think there's a very important role in abstract thinking.
Yes.
Just like you got to have abstract art.
Yeah.
And sometimes those things come together, sometimes they don't, but it's really important to draw the delineation between speculation and theory. Theories can be tested. Speculations are just radical ideas that have yet to formulate a theory. And so sometimes they become one and the same, but usually they do not.
Well, often you can't really do much with them in the moment. And it's kind of just, well, if we get funding for this experiment, we can test this part of it, and then, you know. But,
well, in particular, their connectedness was discussing the works of ions and all of that. And for us, who's very experienced in this stuff, or at least my opinion of it, it really looked like they were doing the same thing, different versions of the same experiment. Some a little more detailed, some a little less detailed. And then every once in a while, they wander out and do something crazy, like hook up an REG to a laser at Burning Man. And for me, there seems to be an underlying ethical conundrum in science. And this isn't directed towards anybody here, it's just in general. And that is the idea that ideas are currency, and that good ideas are hard to come by.
Right.
You know, and people are out there stealing ideas left and right, which actually does happen.
It does.
Quite a bit.
It's happened to you.
Happened to me, sure. It's happened to lots of people.
Yeah.
And so the idea, I think the peer review is very important, but it's also kind of backwards in that we don't have a peer review process as much as we have a peer attack process. And history is replete with examples of great ideas being suppressed for personal agendas. And that's really how it works. That is the foundation of, because if you throw out, let's say, an idea that's testable and modeled and can do it, there's no body, there's no peer reviewed journal that's going to validate it, yes or no. And before you can even generally have a really serious conversation with people, you've got to go through an onslaught of people disagreeing with you every step of the way before they even review it. You know, they will just read the first paragraph and say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, I don't agree with that. And they will never even comprehend what the overall concept is. And so this is one of the reasons. So it's like the idea, the perception is that science and scientists are there to facilitate the rapid progress, or at least the progress of civilization and scientific progress, as quickly as possible. In the fastest, most efficient way possible.
And also that science is self-corrective. So if there's a bad apple or two in there, they'll get self-corrected out of the process without any issues like that. And also that any individual scientist would love to be wrong and is immune to the laws of cognitive dissonance. The basic psychological principles that they found, the same ones studying it, they're immune to it. You know that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but anyone who's not a scientist, or anyone who doesn't have a PhD, of course, they're not immune to it.
Correct.
But
and that's another interesting point, is that a lot of people in the scientist world, particularly if you have a PhD, won't even look at anything from other people that don't have PhDs. So the idea, how many PhDs did the Wright brothers have between them? I don't think any.
I don't know.
I don't know for sure, but I've never heard them referred to as the doctors.
Doctor.
Or anything like that.
I don't know.
But they did have a fundamental grasp of the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yes.
And because they were out in the field practicing, even when the Wright brothers were able to demonstrate flight again and again, they were still challenged.
Yeah.
Did that turn the scientists into thinking that they were wrong and the Wright brothers were right? No. For a lot of them, they just accused them of wrongdoing, and that's still going on today. Yeah, it's still going on today to some extent. So I think their discussion, which did include their group blatantly saying that they were not interested in scientific discoveries. They had no interest in entertaining any ideas from their own community that didn't somehow meet their undetermined criteria for that, while simultaneously continuously putting this out, that giving that perception of exactly what we're saying, that it's an open, feel-free community where it's based on peace, love, and compassion.
Right.
But that's only for us. We don't want you to be a part of it. Peace, love, and compassion for us.
Right.
And hit the road for you. And I think a lot of it's just based in that personal greed, in the sense that they are built into questions that are unanswered. If it's not them that come up with the answers, they can't capitalize on it. And I think that's a huge problem in all of science, not just with us. And that is, I think, for a large part, why it's such a male-dominated field, and why why the STEM is an issue. Because like right now, if you're asking a young girl to become a scientist, you're asking that girl to enter into a battlefield of hostility, of people abusing the scientific method to fit their own needs. Because if you're having a discussion with somebody and you have a very logical argument, and at the end of the argument, the people in authority say, no, that's not right, just because we say it's not right, you're going to be like, hey, this is fucking stupid. I got other things to do. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Oh, pardon the F word. Sorry about that.
We're allowed to curse on here. We said this was not made for kids.
Right. This is not monetized.
This is
and this is hopefully this is just going to be part of our archive, and we'll continue.
Yeah.
And so we got artificial consciousness, the science of not being interconnected, and I thought was one of the most inspirational things I think I've seen yet in the the psychedelics as medicine,
Mm-hmm.
and the power of microdosing. That was a
Yes.
real, like, one of the things you see in this community and in just the San Francisco community is drug abuse rampant, and particularly in psychedelics, where people will use them strictly as party drugs, sex and drugs.
Yeah.
And that's it. And
it's okay to use them as party drugs sometimes.
I think that's
view.
probably
But
most of the
yeah.
introduction to them. But
right.
But to only have them as that, you kind of missing the whole purpose.
Exactly.
Of it. Kind of
exactly.
missing.
If that's all, yes. And I mean, to me, you know, well, I mean, I guess I'll speak from. There's other psychedelic YouTubers out there. I mean, yeah, it was kind of introduced to me in that environment. But you can also, even when you're using it in a recreational setting, I find that there's ways of adding purpose to it, to just not make it just like, oh, I'm just going to see a concert and just whatever, you know, so that I actually get something personal out of it, you know, personalizing the trip. It's never to me just like, oh, this is just for pure dopamine and serotonin floods and nothing else. Where was I going with this? Yeah, one of our team members actually has done some psychedelic research on microdosing, and a lot of what we saw yesterday kind of validates her preliminary findings in that it seems to help people do better with cognitive tasks when you actually just microdose.
Yeah.
And to be clear, microdose means subperceptual, meaning you should not be feeling like you're tripping.
Right.
That doesn't mean you don't feel anything, but that means that it should not interfere with your daily functioning in such a way that you couldn't drive or sense
impaired.
You're not
impaired.
You're not impaired.
Noticeably anything.
Right, cognitively impaired. And that brings up an interesting distinction here. And I think one of the fundamental things that what do you call it? People who are
hyper skeptical.
Yeah, I guess the ones who say that you know, consciousness is purely an emergent byproduct accident and nothing else. There's nothing to the nature of consciousness that you know, and I understand this is partially speculation, but that is non-local, right? The idea of non-local consciousness, consciousness that is not 100% dependent on the brain. And a very good argument for that on their side of saying that non-local consciousness can't possibly exist is the idea that, well, cognition is clearly linearly more or less dependent on brain activity. You put someone in an fMRI, you turn off certain parts of their brain with a transcranial magnetic stimulation, or you damage a certain part of the brain, it damages that part of cognition. Very much one-to-one mapping. And so you can make a whole extrapolation of, oh, if you know the whole brain has no activity, then there's no consciousness. Well, what a lot of psychedelic research has shown is that consciousness and cognition are actually different. You can have very little cognition, meaning you be in a state where you not drive, you can't perceive the world, you forget who you are. You have a complete ego dissolution experience, but yet your consciousness level is super, super high. And so those are two kind of different. Consciousness and cognition are not the same, and that's part of our model in the sense that we are, you know, what we have behind us here. This takes you into inner space, meaning it increases your consciousness.
Let's qualify that. I mean, when we say that, what we're talking about is we have glasses and a headset that uses pulsating light and sound. It's called brainwave entrainment, that will put somebody into a altered state of consciousness, yet still be awake. It's like a dream state.
Right.
And so from that, we have equipment that also can sense that in a state of coherence. And so if we know that we're having that effect when we go into a deep state, we also know that we're just in our regular awake state, we're in a diminished form of that state of that. And so we call this area behind us the inner space travel station because we can actually go into that. And I think that with the equipment that we have on Halo, we will be able to actually program and machine learning algorithms to respond to that. And so the machine becomes, instead of an extension of an individual's consciousness, it's an extension of the collective consciousness of those around it.
Right. It can be an individual or a collective, depending on who's in the room, who's using it, what the setup is, right? Keep in mind, this is not going to look the same everywhere. This is one model of it.
Right.
Kind of think of it like a, more of as, they're not so much specific models of cars that look all the same, but it's more like apartment complexes or condos. Like they all might have a similar structure, but you go inside them, they're all different, right? So like depending on where we take this, what the setup is, there's going to be a slightly different design to it, and
we can make aesthetics,
environment.
all kinds of aesthetics.
Yeah. We were just talking about yesterday with the on something that the Ions page showed with the circle of lights, the bubbles that correspond to RGs. Yeah. We make that into a drone light show, like that in just a massive open air space.
Well, that could be also really dangerous if people were in it. Think about this though. Just think about the same concept as Halo. Yeah. That basically, what did they show you? It was a halo. Yeah. That whole thing was in a halo. So they're kind of on the right track. But imagine those on the ceiling of a big room with Halo controlling it, affecting it. That you would have that effect. Yeah. Same effect. It would more randomness, you get a wider spread. Narrows. Yeah. But we would have the added color components and that ability to sync it all in one color. Yeah. Imagine that. Yeah. Yeah, that would be really, and so I think a large part of our work is that we kind of try to limit ourselves to what we can actually accomplish and measure and create, with the things we have at hand. But there's definitely room for growth and addition to that. So part of these, we have some more people coming on board the team. So part of making this video is reaching out to the community, not just answering questions, but also looking to extend our team for people to collaborate with us either in a formal or informal way in the Bay Area and beyond. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else we need to cover about yesterday? I think that covers it. Does a good job. Yeah. Today was pretty exciting. We're only halfway through the day. Maybe we'll just cut this here short, but this morning started off with a discussion about time and consciousness. And I don't think we should get into that right now, but it did validate. I was looking for something that would invalidate everything we're doing, and didn't see anything. Well, there is concurrence we have to look at too with that. Yeah. But I downloaded one of them, but we'll be probably doing a separate video just on that. Yeah. Cool. All right. So we'll be here all week, doing live videos at least once a day, say through Friday, the duration of conference. And hope you enjoyed that discussion, and see you next time. Take care. Like and subscribe.